So mental health awareness, PTSD. So Active Minds, as you know, is the nation's premier nonprofit organization supporting mental health awareness and education for young adults. We are dedicated to saving the lives and to building stronger families and communities through education, research, advocacy, and focus on young adults aged 14 to 25. Active Minds is opening up the conversation about mental health and creating lasting change in the way mental health is talked about, cared for, and valued in the United States. So I do have a video here. So what is PTSD? It's a cluster of symptoms that follow exposure to a potentially traumatic event. Trauma can be identified in different cultures as different things. What we may find traumatizing, like a car wreck, to someone else, it could just be a fender bender and mean nothing to them, but for someone else that could be traumatic. So that's kind of a hard thing to really identify in the mental health field, is what is trauma, because for everyone that can be different. It is marked by clear cognitive, behavioral, and physiological changes. It can be chronic if untreated and greatly affect quality of life. It's not a sign of weakness, lack of resiliency, or lack of preparation. So PTSD untreated can lead to heightened anxiety, heightened depression, more dissociative features, can even lead to mimic things like bipolar and schizophrenia, if it's untreated for long enough and if it's severe enough trauma. At least 50% of the population will experience trauma in their lifetime, most more than once. Most will experience symptoms of PTSD initially, but won't go on to develop PTSD. There are gender, racial, and ethnic differences in exposure to trauma and development of PTSD. So in a study, it did show that women are far more likely than men to get PTSD. And also, just based on trauma alone, they did a study in Detroit where nearly everyone, I believe it was about 80% of people, experienced at least one, mostly multiple traumas just in the past year or two. And out of, that 80%, only, I think, maybe 10 to 15, I believe, ended up with symptoms of PTSD after that. So it really just varies on, the individual. So combat exposure in Iraq, these are some of the things that did lead to soldiers coming back with PTSD. As you can see, some, to me, having a close call to death and getting hit by a bullet, that's all the way down there at the bottom. But, to me, that would almost feel more traumatizing than seeing the dead bodies, because to me, at war, you're expecting that, but you're not necessarily expecting to actually get shot. So for everyone, the scale is different. So I'd kind of fall more in that 8% than the 95%. But it just kind of shows that there's so many different traumas that go into everything. And some people aren't affected by any of them long term. Others are affected by all of them. So torture is the #1 cause of PTSD, or it has the highest PTSD output. Second would be rape, which is why the women seem to have a higher percentage of PTSD than men, because women are more likely to experience sexual assault, sexual trauma in their lifetime, at least in America. Beating would be the next one. That does associate with gang violence as well as domestic violence. And also, in prisons, that's a reason why a lot of people will come out of the institutions with PTSD, whereas when they went in there, they could have just made a mistake, or, they were selling weed. And then they go in there and they come out with PTSD that goes untreated, and that leads to more criminal activity. And that's kind of what starts part of that prison cycle that's talked about. Other sexual assaults is there. Accidents like a car accident, roller coaster accident, drowning accident, sudden death of a loved one. So like in a car wreck, heart attack, child's illness. For example, my son had pyloric stenosis, which has, a super high life survival rate if treated with surgery, but it was very traumatizing in the moment. Because as a new mother, you just don't know, you're scared of every little thing. So, and with that being such a high survival illness, I can only imagine what it's like when someone has a child with leukemia or a child with cancer, or other diseases such as that. Witness, that's witnessing, a horrific car accident, witnessing acts of war, witnessing acts of assault, rape, natural disaster, especially down in Houston. That's like the hurricanes that come through, flooding. Up here, northern Texas, we had that winter storm where everyone was out of power and we couldn't have clean drinking water for 2 weeks. And that's just unheard of here. So that would be those examples of natural disaster that can traumatize some people. 4 main types of PTSD symptoms. Re-experiencing. These are the things that you see in movies when someone has PTSD. The war veteran that's walking down the street and hears a muffler backfire and suddenly they're back at war. They sit in a corner, they start shaking, they start acting like they have their gun, taking cover. This one's seen a lot in medias. It can be that, it can be act out, it can be visual, but it can also be entirely inside their own mind. So these intrusive thoughts or memories might not be acted out. They might not be charged by something around them. They could just come out of nowhere. It also takes place in nightmares, night terrors, flashbacks, which is what you do see in the media a lot of. Distress when reminded of the event, 5 senses. So in this case, if your trauma was caused by something like a fire in your childhood home, you may start to smell smoke out of nowhere in your day-to-day life. You may start to hear the crackling of the fire or someone screaming or just anything that reminds you of that event. Using all your senses, you may start to feel hot, like there's fire coming in. So it's not limited to just the mind. It's not limited to just these visual pictures like what you see in the media usually. Physiological reactions also you see represented quite frequently. So 4 main types of PTSD. Number 2 is avoidance. Avoidance of trauma-related thoughts, feelings, or conversations. Avoidance of trauma-related places, people, or activities. So using the soldier example in this, someone may come back to America and avoid ever leaving again. Just because, getting on that plane, going somewhere new, being around a particular race or culture, that may all bring back that trauma that they experience and those feelings. And it can be seen as almost racism sometimes, just by the way that they're skeptical or they're avoidant of certain people, when really it's an avoidance technique caused by their PTSD. Third is arousal symptoms, impaired sleep. So those night terrors, some people may wake up screaming or sweating or frozen in space, not knowing where they're at. Irritability or outbursts of anger. This is seen a lot with soldiers who come back, and a lot of them have only learned to fight. That's what got them through the trauma that they were enduring. So sometimes they bring that fight back home with them, and it's not necessarily their fault, especially if they aren't being offered solutions or proper counseling. So you may see that as over drinking and punching holes in the walls. That's a very common thing you see on TVs, in the media, of men, especially who grew up in an abusive childhood home. So that would, in a way, be an outburst of a PTSD symptom. Difficulty concentrating and focusing. So many people with PTSD will be misdiagnosed with ADHD, especially if they are younger when they first have onset of symptoms, just because ADHD isn't as prevalent in adults as it is children. But this is a major thing to look out for, especially if you end up going into the educational field or working with children in some degree. If there's a sudden onset of ADHD symptoms or seemingly ADHD symptoms, it is definitely important to consider that there may have been a trauma that caused that, because ADHD is more slow onset. You just steadily see it throughout life. Whereas when you have that difficulty concentrating and focusing with PTSD, it just hits you all at once. Hypervigilance, again, ADHD, the hyperactivity is very similar to hypervigilance. So hypervigilance is when, you have your head on a swivel, you're walking through a mall and you're constantly looking out for, someone who has a bomb or someone who has a gun, or if, you come from a traumatic childhood, you may see a man and a woman arguing and immediately be like watching around, making sure she's going to be okay. That's that hypervigilance, which also leads to feeling jumpy or easily startled. That's most prevalent or most of the time it's seen in the media as loud noises, but it's not always that. So it can be something as simple as, feeling someone behind you and looking around and being terrified. It can be smelling something that takes you back into the moment and suddenly you're on edge and you're hypervigilant, you're scared. So those are some of those arousal symptoms of PTSD. Lastly, negative alterations in thoughts and mood. So as I said, PTSD, when left untreated especially, will lead to heightened anxiety and heightened depression, difficulty remembering aspects of the event, blocking it out, repressing those memories, exaggerated beliefs or expectations about the self and others or the world. No one can be trusted. I'm all alone. I can't do anything to change this. The world's so bad. Things like that. Loss of interest in past enjoyable experiences. So you may have, used to enjoy going to the mall, but now it's full of reminders of trauma. Or, maybe a soldier used to love to vacation overseas, but now again, it's just a reminder and it just ruins that. And it may not even be related to the trauma. I mean, if you're a soccer player and you love soccer, but then you experience a car wreck, you may not want to go back to playing soccer because they're going to ask you, if you're okay. They're going to ask details, or there may be some reminder somewhere and you're just not comfortable with being in public when it happens. So it can really have a major effect across all aspects of life. That leads to the feeling of detachment or cutting off from others. And it's kind of that big thing about, if you feel like you're being pushed away, you push others away. So a lot of the time, a trauma can lead to you pushing everyone around you away because you almost feel contagious. Either that, or you feel like they're just going to trigger you over and over. And that alone can lead to emotional numbness. Emotional numbness and depression are almost the same thing. Whereas depression, you're sad, you can feel the sorrow and the sadness. That would really be the only difference, because other than that, emotional numbness and sadness can lead to the same kind of behaviors. So associated problems. This is what I was saying. PTSD can lead to anxiety and panics, depression, relationship problems, physical health problems, and especially substance abuse. That's why we see so many people, so many soldiers or so many victims of rape or domestic violence turn to alcohol or turn to marijuana or pills or, Xanax. They just turn to some kind of substance to either try to numb what they're going through or even to try to feel again. So substance abuse kind of goes both ways with PTSD. And it can seem like a cure-all for almost everyone who's experienced a trauma, when really it just magnifies the trouble and it just causes more anxiety, more depression, more physical health problems, and certainly more relationship problems, as well as legal problems. So that's definitely something to consider, you know, if you are going into the counseling field, or if you are working with people in that case, and there's a sudden onset of substance abuse, a sudden onset of depression, or anxiety, PTSD may be to play. Psychological therapy of the development and maintenance of PTSD symptoms. So PTSD is full of contradictions. Virtually every reaction that mental health professionals label a symptom, and which indeed can cause havoc in your life after returning home from combat, is an essential survival skill in the war zone. So this did give that example from Charles Hogue. He's an MD, also a colonel in the Army, back in 2010. So that is that typical war example of PTSD that you always see. Now, that can also be applied to all the other examples. Say, childhood, you're a child in an abusive household. You learn to be, let's say, the protector of the mother who's being abused. So you learn to fight, you learn to stand up, you learn to go emotionally numb, to stop caring about yourself, because if you do, you can't do what it takes to save the other person. So all of those are survival skills for that child, but if they bring that into adulthood, they can turn into, of course, someone who abuses substances, someone who abuses other people, someone who picks fights, someone who's so emotionally cut off, they gain more depression, they may even commit suicide in the future. And all of that just stemming from wanting to be the protector of a loved one in childhood. So it's very contradictory that wanting to be a hero can turn you into the villain. Common reactions to trauma. These we discussed earlier, but again, it's re-experiencing an adaptive function of that. Easily accessed memories that warn of danger. So if you get PTSD when you're overseas and you're still over there on tour for 2 more years, that hypervigilance can be an amazing tool. You may start to smell something that reminds you of that time a bomb went off, and you're actually smelling it, and you locate another bomb before it goes off. I'm not a soldier myself, but that is just an example, you know, from media that I have seen. So there are these adaptive functions, and there are these reasons that humans have evolved and still experience this, because it is a survival skill. PTSD is the ultimate survival skill. The only problem is once you're out of that trauma, it's how to drop that wall that's put up, and how to learn how to kind of reintegrate into society as a normal person without this almost superpower that you had when you were in the trauma. Avoidance, an adaptive function, is it reduces the likelihood of repeated exposure. So you have an abusive household, you turn 18, you get out of the house, and you never go back and see your parents again. I mean, you'll never see that trauma again, but is it really the best thing for moving forward with your life? Or will it always have you kind of looking back and wondering what if? Hyperarousal, increased attention to threat and display of preparedness. Again, back to that soldier. It can really be a superpower when you're in that moment, but when you come back to normal life, it can impede on so many aspects of your life that you can't really live it to the fullest. Associative learning. So this soldier, say this would be a normal day for him, you know, nothing out of the normal, just having a good day. Say right after this picture, you know, a bomb goes off, killing the rest of the squadron. Now suddenly a child's laughter can trigger that memory. Dust in the air can trigger it. Seeing the ethnically dressed people like in the background can trigger it. Being around a group of kids can trigger it. All of these things can turn into triggers, as opposed to before, he may have never thought about it. He may not have recognized his knee pain, but maybe that knee pain is what caused him to hold back and his squadron go forward into danger. So just these simple little things can lead to this increased hypervigilance in the real world. Say he comes back and he is at a mall in Wisconsin. I mean, odds are he's not going to see ethnic dress or, anything that obviously reminds him of over there, but then let's say a group of kids run past him laughing. I mean, it's just so crazy that our brains can associate two things that are, worlds apart, but it can pull us all the way back into the past, into that moment overseas, even though you're so far ahead of it. It's 10 years later, you're across the world, but in your body, in your mind, it goes back to that past. So cognitive changes. Here's just some more examples of how PTSD led to hypervigilance, led to that fear, led to that refraining or withdrawing from society, that self-blame, that depression, anxiety. Natural recovery. So over time, PTSD, when you have counseling, when you can talk about it, when you can recognize it, when you understand, you have that support, you're in a good place, you're not re-experiencing new traumas, it will decrease over time. Now, that's not to say, PTSD will necessarily disappear altogether. There may be, some lingering hypervigilance. There may be some, lingering fear of people. But overall, you can get better. You can live a normal life. Things can go back, for the most part, to how they should be for you. Whereas if you avoid talking about what happened, if you avoid confronting PTSD, you avoid getting the diagnosis in the first place, and you go with the repression method where you just repress everything that happened, just don't talk about it, don't think about it, and it'll go away. Unfortunately, with PTSD, it won't. As you can see, it'll kind of, that red line, the symptoms will kind of fade, but then they'll come back, and then they'll fade and come back. And I mean, sometimes that can be a bigger range. It can, fade even more, but then come back a lot faster as soon as something reminds you or triggers that. So the number one thing for people with PTSD is to have some sort of support system and some sort of awareness of why they're going through what they're going through, and that they can make a difference for the better. So here's that avoidance again. So now he's going to avoid all of those things as much as he can. So generalization of beliefs. This is a lot of the time why cognitive behavioral therapy is used for people with PTSD. It kind of helps change the way you think. It changes the way you translate things in your life. So here, I missed the IED, so I am incompetent. I asked for this, I'm a trash. All these things, putting yourself down, trying to rationalize that you deserve something to happen to you when you didn't. These can lead to those, the deterioration of self because of PTSD. Now, with something like cognitive behavioral therapy, they might ask you how you can rephrase this in a good way as opposed to a bad way about yourself. So, I missed the IED. You could say, I did my best. I was on the lookout. I have learned now, in some way, just rephrase that to where you're seeing the good in yourself and not putting yourself down and rationalizing what happened. Current research suggests a number of physiological differences found in people diagnosed with PTSD. So there are hormonal and brain differences due to onset of PTSD. Abnormalities in the stress response hormone levels. So these are those things that make your body feel like you're back in that moment, like it's do or die. Put that fight, flight, freeze or fawn instincts into check. Those are actually caused by a physical difference in your body due to this mental trauma or sometimes physical trauma. Responsible for preparing our bodies to respond to threat, constant state of readiness. So this again, that hypervigilance can be a good thing, but when your body's constantly on edge and constantly scared and stressed, it really does so much damage to your brain. So the brain differences: a smaller hippocampus, inhibition of the HPA axis and processing of memories. So this is why memories can seem to go from the past to the future, and you get that anxiety because you feel like it's about to happen, even though it's already happened. Overreaction of the amygdala. So that kind of helps regulate things. And in this case, there's no regulation. There's nothing in your brain telling itself, you know, calm down. This isn't real. This isn't happening right now. This isn't about to happen. It just kind of lets things go off, lets things fire, and these neurotransmitters triggering more and more hormones to flood your body, and these memories replaying in your head that shouldn't be there as thoughts of a future, as well as an underactive prefrontal cortex, which that and the amygdala do play hand in hand. So for treatment, there is psychotherapy and there's pharmacotherapy. So a significant benefit of psychotherapy is cognitive processing therapy, also cognitive behavioral therapy, prolonged exposure therapy. So that's going to be where you're over and over exposed to something reminding you of the event to kind of desensitize you from it. Stress inoculation training, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing. So all of these things are almost exposure therapy because you are going to be talking about what happened, but led by someone who understands and someone who knows how to lead you into a better life or a better thought process. So on the other side, we have the pharmacotherapy. So that's something so many people are familiar with. Things like SSRIs, SNRIs, antidepressants, anti-adrenergic. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that one too well. So these are all things to kind of combat the symptoms of PTSD, but these are certainly not cures for PTSD. So let's say venlafaxine, for example, also known as Effexor. That is something used commonly to treat anxiety, sometimes depression. Same with paroxetine or sertraline. All of those SSRIs are often, prescribed for depression or anxiety, in which they can nearly cure those symptoms and nearly cure the disease itself, because the disease is its symptoms. Whereas with PTSD, as you saw before, it is physical as well as mental. So these SSRIs and SNRIs, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication, sleeping pills, all of these things that are often prescribed, from the VA especially, they don't actually cure PTSD. They are not a cure. Even though you may be taking these pills your entire life, constantly going up in dosages, switching pills, taking 20 a day, all that's doing is combating the symptoms mentally. Now, those physical symptoms may still be there, and it's not going to decrease over time. It's just going to be hidden. So that's where the psychotherapy is definitely needed, no matter what. Some kind of counseling in addition to medication is the only way to really combat PTSD. Active elements in EBP for PTSD. So psychoeducation, reviewing traumatic memories, stress arousal reduction techniques, exposure to avoided situations, modification of trauma-related beliefs. That's like the CBT thing I mentioned before, activity. So all of these are just ways that a counselor or even a friend sometimes who cares enough to study up can try to help you, or you could use to help yourself a little bit, delay those symptoms or give those symptoms less power over your life. So these are those things that, in addition sometimes to medication, can actually help PTSD itself fade, not just be hidden. So prolonged exposure therapy, here's kind of a breakdown of an imaginary session, 9 to 15 sessions, usually about 10. They're about an hour and a half long, and then a breakdown of kind of what they would do throughout it. Now, this is not saying one size fits all. This is not the same for everyone with PTSD. Not everyone will go through this, 1 through 10 step list. So it is personalized to the person, but that was just an example for you. So here's the exposure hierarchy. If you're doing something like exposure therapy, or someone with PTSD is going through this, it is an extremely hard process. So as you can see, step 1 would be going to a grocery store with your partner when it's not busy. So with your partner, you have that support, you have that trust, you have that backbone with you. It's not busy, so there's reduced triggers, even though there still may be a couple triggers. So that's about 30 points of exposure. And then let's look, about halfway down at number 10, you're in line facing forward or no wall behind you. So here you are alone, you were exposed, you're facing forward, you're not letting your head swivel to check for dangers. This can be so terrifying to someone who's experienced trauma, especially let's say a woman who's experienced a sexual assault, who originally came at her from behind. This can be so terrifying for that woman. So this is only halfway down that list, and you already lost your trust and support, and you've already lost the ability to let your hypervigilance help calm you as well. So then we go all the way down, and to be in a grocery store alone and it's crowded, or mall alone and crowded, both of those things, no matter what your trauma, there is likelihood that you will be exposed to something that reminds you of it. Whether there's a man who reminds you of something that's happened, there's a woman dressed in ethnic clothing that reminds you of something, there's the sound of someone dropping a can in an aisle, there's a certain smell. It's just, there's so many things that go into being in a mall or a grocery store, and there's so many different types of trauma, but somehow nearly everyone can be triggered in those places. And especially when it's crowded, so there's, so much more activity than usual, and you're alone, so you have no sense of support. So this is one of the most traumatizing things for people. Now, if someone was, say, traumatized by an elevator malfunction and it crashed down, number 8 may end up being number 20 for them, because the elevator specifically carries that trigger. So this, again, is going to be dependent on the person, but they do go through an exposure hierarchy similar to this with most people who have experienced PTSD. Just, it is customized to the person. So anxiety increases avoidance. The situation is dangerous. I got out just in time. Something awful could have happened. So this can lead to you giving in to PTSD, you basically letting it control you and change your thoughts and change your activities and everything about your life. So whereas normally, you go to the grocery store, let's say something bad happened to you there, you come home, you end up getting PTSD from the event. And later, you're about to go back, and then you decide, no, I'm not going to go back into that grocery store because it's going to happen again. So you turn around and go home. That is giving PTSD and anxiety that power to convince you that, yeah, it really would have happened if you would have gone in there. So you can never go back in there because it will happen. And the only way to break that habituation is through exposure therapy, is through forcing yourself to go in there and realize that just because it's the same place or reminds you of something, that does not mean it's going to happen to you again. You have to take power over the event and over what happened and not let it control you again. So when you stop avoidance, so let's say this peak right here, let's say that's when you get to that grocery store door, or you're standing in line with people behind you at the grocery store. So you are at that peak anxiety because of that PTSD and that trauma that you experienced, and you just know that it's about to happen to you again. And then it doesn't, and you get out to your car. So now, you've just decreased the power PTSD has over you by whatever percentage that is. Now, next time you go to the grocery store, you're going to be starting off here. You're going to get a little burst of anxiety, and then again, it's going to go even lower. And that's how you regain that power, or someone with PTSD can regain that power. Cognitive processing therapy. I'm going to let y'all kind of read through these. So these are just, again, sessions, kind of breakdowns of what people would go through if they had PTSD and they were in a therapy session. So if you have a parent or you have a friend or a relative of some kind that you know has PTSD and is going through therapy, these are some things that they may be facing and they may be having to confront, once or twice a week. And a lot of the times they don't talk about it outside of that. So if they need to, or if they come home from therapy and you see that there's a cloud over them, just keep in mind that they're reliving this thing that happened to them, and they're fighting and fighting over and over every week to take back power of themselves. So be there for them, be there to listen, non-judgmentally, be a shoulder to cry on. In general, trauma-focused therapies are more effective than non-specific supportive interventions and no treatment. So if you have PTSD, the T stands for trauma. So if you just ignore that altogether, and let's say a counselor is treating you like someone who just has general anxiety about life, and they're not focusing on what has caused it, it's really not going to do that much for someone with PTSD. So that is why that behavioral and trauma-focused therapy is so important. So here are some more PTSD resources. If you personally have PTSD or you know someone who does, I encourage you to maybe take down a little bit of this information. I will have that website in the chat for you as well, if you want to just bookmark it or write it down, so that you could share it with someone who you feel like may need it. Or if you end up making a friend in the future and you find out that they have PTSD, it is something that you can go to learn more about how to help them or how to help them help themselves. So I'm going to leave this up for just a second. And as you can see, there's also that app. Again, it gives great information on PTSD, a good way to kind of self-diagnose if you're like, maybe I do have PTSD, but you don't know for sure and you're scared to waste the counselor's time for some reason, or you're scared to waste money on counseling if you're not going to a college like we are where you can go see a counselor. This is a way for you to kind of validate those thoughts, kind of find some ways to help yourself, some skills to deal with some of the symptoms. So that's a really amazing app. Even if you just have stress or anxiety, I know there's so many apps out there already for that, but this one does work for that as well. So again, that's something I encourage you to maybe take note of, because there are so many people, even in college, who've experienced trauma from childhood car wrecks, sexual assaults. So the odds are someone, whether you know they have PTSD or not, odds are you do know someone who is struggling. And here's another source. And again, I will be putting this into the chat for you. And these as well. Now, as you can see, there's so many resources for people who want to help with PTSD, who want to help limit those symptoms. But yet we still have such a high prevalence rate of untreated PTSD. That's largely due to the lack of awareness of how common this is. It's not just soldiers that experience this. And it's actually only getting worse with time. So, I mean, most of us here, probably all of us, were alive during 9/11. For some people, that was an extremely traumatic event, and they will be struggling with PTSD because of that for a large portion of their life. For others, it was just another day, something bad happened, and the end. But trauma can affect everyone in different ways. So now I'm just going to ask if any of you have any questions while I transfer back over to the slides. Go ahead and ask either in the chat or unmute.
Errors.
All right, if there's no questions, I'm going to go ahead and let this video play. I'm going to unmute the ad for just a second. If you don't hear anything, please let me know so I can make sure the sound is working for y'all.
As a matter of fact, for what it's worth, Grammarly can, yeah, that's long. We can get rid of that.
Okay, I'm going to mute it again. Hopefully you all heard that. If not, someone please let me know. That way, when the video starts, you do hear all of it.
And having that identical twin sister, and my background in neuroscience is probably giving my husband more stress than he ever thought he knew when he married me. He thought he was getting one person, he received two. They asked us earlier this morning how we felt going into the TED Talks, and one of my very creative other presenters said, feel like Katniss going into the Hunger Games. That's kind of what I feel like, and my subject is post-traumatic stress disorder, which I think I have today. So I'll start out with our poem. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. One moment, he's on the wall, eating a hamburger, drinking a beer, talking about the Friday night football game, and the next minute, he's a scrambled egg. His mind, his body, and his emotions are very different. So this is our active learning. I want you to look at the person to your right and to your left. And I want you to think, can you tell that this person has gone through some really traumatic event? Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. But the answer is probably no. Because we call it the hidden wound. I like to refer to it as the silent scream, because it's very much in that person, but most of us can't see it, can't hear it, and can't feel it, but they can, and they're not going to talk about it. Now, I have been married to my husband for over 40 years. He's a Vietnam vet. I didn't know him before he went over, which is probably a good thing. On the other hand, I didn't know what normal looked like for him. So he arrived in country 3 weeks after his 21st birthday. He was one of the older ones. He was a second lieutenant. And on his first week there, he was sleeping in a tent with 2 other second lieutenants when a rocket exploded over their tent. 1 person was killed, 1 person lost an arm and a leg, and he was injured. But not bad enough to be sent back home. It's like, welcome to Vietnam. And after a few weeks, when he was healed enough, they sent him on his first mission, and that was out in the jungles of Vietnam, where he stayed and lived day in and day out, experiencing tremendous high doses of traumatic events that dealt with life and death experiences. Now, we had no idea where some of his, for the first 25 years, where some of his strange, over-the-top behaviors were coming from. Like if he opened the refrigerator door and there was a certain smell that he didn't like. He had a very abnormal event to that. Having toys or materials on the floor that shouldn't be there, not a good thing in his eyes. Now, our military and our first responders are highly trained to be in abnormal events so that they have normal, for them, responses to be able to survive battle. And even with all that training, they cannot be inoculated against post-traumatic stress. By definition, post-traumatic stress is an anxiety disorder that develops in reaction to a physical injury or a severe mental or emotional distress. Now, I'm not going to name all the ways you can get post-traumatic stress. All you have to do is look on your cell phone, open a paper, turn on the news, and there's millions of different types of ways you can get post-traumatic stress. But here's a fairly new one, and it's happening to our young people. It's called cyberbullying. And cyberbullying for a young mind puts them into that mental and emotional distress. In Larimer County, and we're not all that big, we had 81 suicides last year. 2 of them were 11 years old. 1 was 12. If it takes a village to raise a child, it will take a village to help support and heal the wounded, all of the wounded at any age in our society. And I'm going to take issue to the word disorder. We're changing the language because post-traumatic stress, by a neurological standpoint, is not a disorder. It's a reordering of your neural networks and pathways and your sensory pathways so that you can survive in a really dangerous situation. I tell my students here at CSU that the one reason you get a brain is not to pick out your girlfriend for a Saturday night date. It's much more primal than that, although that might be pretty primal. But you get it to survive. The brain is organized so you, when you get in difficult situations, may live through that difficult situation. It helps you through that. And I also tell my students, experience sculpts the brain. Good experiences, bad experiences, the brain doesn't care. All it's doing is taking information from the environment through our senses, sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, that lets us know we're green light, everything's okay. We're yellow light, that's tolerable stress. It's actually supposed to help us, our immune system. I get that driving down the freeway, and at 80 miles an hour, I see somebody texting. Okay, and I'm no longer in tolerable stress. I may go into that red zone, the toxic zone. This is the one, is what's happening with the brain, is that our prefrontal cortex, that may not all be all that developed anyway, is now starting to shut down. I can't get information to it fast enough. The hippocampus is getting shorter. That's where we have short-term memory. Example, I got in the shower today, turned off the water, and said, did I wash my hair? I am Katniss in the Hunger Games. And the amygdala is what I call the traffic cop. It is where it starts getting the information from all the senses. And the amygdala does this. Oh goodness, we're in the red zone. I'm rallying the troops. I'm telling them to call into the hippocampus or the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the adrenal glands, release those stress hormones. Get me ready to fight and flight. So I release adrenaline, noradrenaline, epinephrine, cortisone, glucose, and it's not going up here for me to think. It's going into my limbs so I can fight the heck out of my way out, or better yet, I'm going to run faster than any of the rest of you and be safe. Now, eventually, our sensory systems become a little overwhelmed. You think? They become sensitized to what's happening, so they're easily triggered. We hear things that may not be there, or we don't hear things that are there. My husband blames me on not hearing what I've told him. Vision. We see things that aren't there, and we don't see things that are there. And driving down the highway, that's not a good thing to have. So in that brain change, the sensory system, when it's overloaded, looks like this. You become hypervigilant and hyper-aroused. So we like to go on ski trips. We started our kids when they were toddlers. And we had to be out of the house at 6 in the morning. Now, for any of you who have had toddlers and you're trying to get them awake, fed and dressed by 6 in the morning, you better have a miracle on hand. At 1 minute after 6, my husband's pacing. At 2 minutes after 6, he's getting a little anxious. At 3 minutes after 6, now he's irritable. And at 4 minutes after 6, he's found language. And it sounds like this. Hurry up. You're going too slow. What's the matter with you? We planned on this last night. We were going to be in the car driving down the road at 6 o'clock in the morning. Well, we eventually get there. Although I didn't want to be in that car with him, and nor did my sons. And going down the road, whoa! All of a sudden, he's singing. He's happy. We're a mess. But now he's in control. No worries. We made it past the danger. Now, this is what we didn't understand. We didn't understand that in combat, if you're late, people died. But subconsciously, he knew that, and that he carried with him. Nightmares, night sweats, panic attacks. Insomnia, which really messes up the brain for short-term memory, and also your immune system. You kind of need sleep. Flashbacks, another story. We like to go to Elijah's, a big amusement park in Denver. And my boys and myself, we would usually go with neighbors and friends, except for this one Saturday. And my husband decided to go with us. And we had a favorite ride. It was called the Dragon. It looked like a dragon, and it went up. Some of you may know this. Came down fast, pulling those G's. Woohoo! Went up, came down fast. We're loving this. We can hardly wait to get him on that ride. So we board, and it goes up, and it comes down, and it goes up, and it comes down, and I'm looking at my husband, and he should be laughing. But he's turned white and ashen colored, and he's starting to say in a very anxious voice, I've got to get off of this ride. You have to make it stop. I have got to get off of this ride. And you can't. It has 10 more fun cycles. As soon as he got off, he ran to a bathroom, threw up, came back. He's this ashen color still, and he says, we have to go home. I'm really sick. Now, we just thought it was that hot dog he ate for lunch. Makes sense, blame everything on hot dogs. But this is what was really happening. That ride triggered a flashback from when he was in Vietnam. And on one occasion, he was flying right wing in helicopters. And they had gone into a hot combat zone to remove some wounded military. They were all loaded on the helicopter. They were starting to take off 20, 30 feet off the ground. He, being right wing, hadn't quite buckled his seatbelt when the helicopter took a direct hit. He was blown out. And when he landed, he looked at himself, and he was covered in the oil, the gas, and the blood of everyone in that helicopter. That was his flashback. That's what that fun ride did to him. It was anything but fun. Those overwhelming waves of emotion that you would do anything to get rid of just keep flowing. The personality changes where you're more anxious, you're more irritable, you may become angry. You may have feelings of detachment, and you want to just isolate because you no longer fit into that normal world. You used to, but you don't now. And trying to be with all of you when I'm not normal, hey guys, you're my triggers. There are days I don't want to be around people, and nor does he. Eventually, that may make us feel different about who we are, how we lived, how we proceed in our environment. And if you don't get a handle on it, this is what happens, is that your brain and your body start to wear out. High incidence of hypertension. You have chronic incidence of strokes and different types of heart attacks. We know we have obesity, we have diabetes, we have ulcers, we have chronic fatigue syndromes. There's so many issues to our body when it starts to wear out. But this is what we can do. This is the good news. We can start healing, but it's by doing something that helps us heal. Things like, we know that cognitive therapy and feedback, biofeedback work. We know that doing things like exercise helps us. We know, and we're getting smarter, because if information is coming from our body, why not start working on our body first, like massage, yoga, Tai Chi, meditation, because what those are doing, it's resetting our breathing back to normal. We take a lot of that's fly fishing, because the motion of that fly back and forth mimics that good heartbeat and that healthy breathing. We have our dog, he's a service dog, Bailey, just stroking him helps. So there's all kinds of positive things that we can do to heal, and we've been practicing that for years. In the end, it is not in the hoping that we might heal. It is in the doing that will help us move forward. And I can tell you at this time in our lives, Maya Angelou says, when we know better, we do better. We know better, and we've practiced hard. We're going to win that Hunger Games. We're going to be those survivors. And in spite of those traumatic experiences, we've become stronger. We've become more compassionate, not more doubtful. We've definitely become more grateful for every single thing we have in our lives and our days, versus angry at things we don't have or may have lost. And we've become wiser. Marshall Probst says, in wisdom, you do not receive wisdom. You discover it within yourselves after a journey that no one can take for you or with you. And in our silence, we say the Serenity Prayer, which calms us down. And we are learning to finally begin to bear what it once felt so unbearable to us, and to heal what once felt so shattered. Thank you.
Now, that kind of gives you a personal relationship or an example. An example of PTSD in the real world. So that roller coaster, that could be part of his therapy in the future. Maybe, taking that roller coaster ride's a way to desensitize what had happened to him in that helicopter overseas. So simple things like that can just make a dramatic difference. You just have to understand where someone's coming from, what's happened to them, in order to help them through that trauma and to help them start to live a normal life again. Bear with me just a second and I'll get that PowerPoint back up. We are almost at the end. I apologize, it is lasting a little over an hour now. There's just so much information about PTSD, and it's such a complicated, like she said, not necessarily disorder, but complicated trauma and complicated stress response. All right, so that was Janet Seahorn. That was her TED Talk, again, about her husband with PTSD. Now, I'm not going to go to this link, but Brian Adams with Active Minds, you can find it on our website. I'm also going to have this PowerPoint and this link. If any of you would like it, feel free to reach out to me. I'm just trying to save us a little bit of time here. I will go to it for just a second so that you can see what is there for you.
My name is Brian. I served in the Army for 3 years. I was deployed to Iraq in 2004. I joined when I was 18. I didn't know I was going to be deployed because the unit I joined, I got to choose where I wanted to go. So I went to Germany because I wanted to see Europe and stuff. And then, the Iraq war started. I wasn't ready for it. I mean, the first 5 days that we were there, I had one of my friends get killed. And it was just like, reality sunk in extremely fast that, this was a very, very dangerous place and we were going to be there for a long time.
So this is going to be more of that firsthand experience with PTSD, whereas the TED Talk was, primarily about her husband and how she viewed his handling of that. Whereas this one, you know, he personally lived it. He came back and he dealt with PTSD. As you can see, I mean, he's well spoken. He can talk about the trauma. A lot of people aren't at that point. So he's definitely made a lot of progress in handling the stress disorder. And this is going to be the last one. The reason I'm doing PTSD as our first really kind of exclusive event as far as mental illnesses, disorders, mental health goes. So far, it's been a lot of generic, you know, mental health tips, whereas this, you know, is a really personal disorder for me. I was diagnosed with PTSD at 17. I'm currently 26 years old. So, you know, 9 years later, I'm able to talk about it. I feel like I'm at a good place. I am on medication. I do take venlafaxine like we saw before. I've taken Paxil. I've taken pretty much every pill you saw on that previous slideshow, just because that's how so many people want to deal with disorders. They just want to throw medication at it because it's just a quick fix. But it's not. PTSD is more than stress. It's more than depression. It's a whole change of yourself, and getting yourself back or transforming back into a new self after that takes a lot of work. So my original trauma, I did grow up in a very violent and abusive household. I had a mother with antisocial personality disorder that caused almost bipolar-like symptoms, a lot of outbursts, and just frankly, things seemed crazy. So I started to develop some defense techniques like running off. We lived in a small lake community. I'd go swimming. I'd go out to the dock and just sit there before I could swim. And that actually led to the original first trauma I experienced, which was drowning. In my life, I drowned 3 times. That was highly due to the fact that that was my only escape. Not to say it was, you know, a suicidal notion that, you know, I'm going to do this because I know I'll die, but I did it just to try to escape. And that defense mechanism of run away, go somewhere peaceful, always drove me to the lake, because to me that was peace, even though it ended up leading to a near-death experience or a death experience 3 times. Just trying to run away from trauma led to new trauma. The sequel. So 2005, that started with self-harming. So I was a victim of domestic violence as well as self-violence up until I was about 21 years old. I actually did not stop until I gave birth to my son. And that kind of trauma and that kind of pain and just numbness can lead to so many people going to substances, going to self-harm, going into abusive relationships, because that's what they know to be normal. And that's what a lot of people with PTSD also do. And the saga, when about 2009, I was about 16, my grandfather got me out of that house, out of that abusive situation. And as soon as I moved in, a couple of months later, he died. And I had to perform CPR to keep him alive for just the extra minute so that we could say goodbye. So I've experienced multiple traumas in my life. If you ever read the book, The Evil Hours, we're reading it now in Abnormal Psychology. It is an amazing book. And he equates trauma to bullets. Whereas someone, you know, maybe hit with some high caliber trauma, like a car wreck, you know, or that helicopter crash where everyone around him died and he lived, but with trauma, that one giant instance, that's like a high caliber bullet, like you're hit with that sniper rifle of trauma. Whereas my trauma, I was originally diagnosed as CPTSD, which was complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So I kind of equate it to being shot with like a 22, just over and over and over throughout my life. So the caliber of my trauma was not that big, but it was relentless. So that took so long to get over. It takes so long to desensitize these survival techniques that you learn when you learn them to so many different triggers, so many different situations that have caused you to grow this self-defense. So that's why here, 9 years later, I still do have instances where my PTSD gets the best of me. But the only reason I'm here and I can talk about these things without going into a full dissociative breakdown, and I'm no longer self-harming and I'm no longer reacting like I was to the things that have happened, is because I have had therapy, I've had medication, I have confronted that PTSD that tries to control my life, and I don't let it. So at first I was diagnosed with ADHD, or ADD technically, when I was about 13. So that's only after the second trauma. So that, it explained a lot of things. It explained my kind of sporadic hypervigilance, my jumpiness, my deflections of things. Like if something started to remind me of something, I'd just start spouting off this random weird facts or whatever, just trying to deflect. So I was diagnosed with ADD at first. I was later diagnosed with anxiety and then depression. I went through a lot of things before I finally was able to come clean with someone who I trusted and ended up with the proper diagnosis and the proper medications. So shedding light on all of the trauma with someone who you trust, or encouraging someone to be honest about, everything that's happened, not just your symptoms, but your past. That is why that is so important in counseling and so important with growth. And here we have coping and growing. The best thing you can do is find community, or encourage someone with PTSD to find community and find support. So my husband now, he's part of my support. He's part of my community. My grandfather then was part of my community, part of my support. And that's why losing him just kind of tailspun my PTSD for the worse. So really, even if you were an antisocial introvert like myself, I'll go to campus, to see y'all, to talk with everyone here and there, but I live near Dallas. I'm going to a college almost purely remotely, just because I still am not great with a lot of people in big situations. That's something I'm still working on. But here behind a computer screen, I can talk to you, I can share these things, and I can feel good doing it because I know that I'm educating y'all, and y'all can make a difference or educate other people in making a difference to someone else who is dealing with this and who isn't quite where I am with my processing and with my growth. So the best thing you can do is be that support for someone. That being said, a lot of the times the medication is also very helpful throughout the process. It's very hard to go through CBT, to go through exposure therapy, to go through desensitization therapies without something to kind of take the edge off that stress and that depression. So if you do know someone who's struggling, I do highly encourage you to refer them somewhere where they can get treatment for it as well, from professionals, from a psychiatrist, and possibly medications to help them through that process. So I did post, a couple of things there in the chat for you. Here's also some hotlines that you can call. Always remember, we do have a counseling department at the university. Do not be afraid to refer anyone to them. Don't be afraid to refer people to a mental health department or clinic in the city, in their city. There's a texting hotline. There's just so many things that you can do, so many places you can reach out to for help. No one deserves to struggle alone. No one deserves to struggle at all. But especially not alone. So we at Active Minds, nationally as well as here on campus, we want to spread this awareness. We want to spread these resources because no one deserves to suffer, and no one deserves to suffer alone. So I really want to thank y'all for coming here to learn a little more about PTSD, learn more about what you can do, as well as things to look out for and these resources to refer people to. Like I said, this is a very personal event for me, so I can't thank y'all enough for being here. I'm going to have events highlighting the other major mental disorders throughout the year, such as schizophrenia, bipolar, learning disabilities such as autism. We already have the event scheduled for that one on April 1st with our guest speaker. So I do highly encourage y'all to look at our future events. And if you have any questions about PTSD or about other resources, people who you think might be struggling, how to talk to them. I'm actually sending you my personal phone number there in the chat. I normally would give you, you know how to reach us at Active Minds. They're on campus groups, you can message us. We have the group me. My name's Alexis Beaudin. I'm the president. You can find me through there. You can reach me through email and stuff. But this is personal to me. And if there's some way I can help you help someone or help you help yourself, I will do that anytime. So if you don't want to reach out to someone through Active Minds because you think, you know, even though they're an advocate, maybe they don't really understand though. I do, and I'm here. So I do want you to have that number. Even if it's an uncle you have who, you know, has PTSD from war. If you want to give them my number because they don't know anyone outside of war that just re-triggers them, who they can talk to, I'm here. And I encourage y'all to do whatever you can to be there for people. But if you need someone to be there for you, or someone else needs someone else to talk to about personal experiences they're going through, I am here. So that QR code, it should take you to our group if you haven't already joined us with Active Minds. I encourage you to do so. At this time, we're not charging fees or anything for joining us. We just want to spread this awareness. We want to spread these resources. So please, please join us just to get these updates and these resources and be able to talk to us and communicate. And I want to know now, do any of you have any questions? Does anyone have any stories or any personal connections with PTSD that you wouldn't mind sharing? I'll give you a couple of minutes, and if you want, let me know and I'll turn off the recording, or I'll cut it from the recording. So not everyone has to hear it, but I would love if you'd like to share with us. If you don't want to, then there's no pressure. You do not have to say anything at this point. And I do thank y'all. I know we ran about 30 minutes over time. We had a lot of people joining in a little after 4. So yeah, y'all are all free to go. I thank you again for being here with us. Let me stop the sharing. So I am a real person. I know a lot of that was, you know, some pre-recorded stuff, slideshows, TED Talk. But again, if any of you want to reach out, I am here. I'm stopping the recording now. So if any of you want to talk,